Burned into her shoulder, a company brand would cost a hunted gunslinger everything he'd been hiding the moment he knelt beside her at a dry relay cistern before sunrise and set his coat over her ruined back. Before that, there was only the smell. Hot iron and singed cotton and something under it that no amount of desert wind could carry off. The smell that clings to a person the way guilt clings to a man who has done something he cannot take back. There was the sound, too, before the smell, if you want the truth of it, in the order it came to him, the low complaint of a mourning dove somewhere in the mesquite, and under that, so faint he almost rode past it, a breath, not a moan. A breath held too long by somebody trying not to be found. The stone rim of the cistern was cold enough that it had gathered a skin of frost in the low places, the kind of high desert cold that arrives in the last black hour before dawn and burns off within the first 20 minutes of sun, so that a man learns to trust nothing about the temperature of a morning in that country, not the promise of heat that follows it. Elias Crane felt that cold first through the knees of his trousers when he went down beside her, and only after did his eyes catch up to what his hands and his nose already knew. A young woman, curled small against the stone the way a person curls when the body is decided, on its own, without asking permission, that it is done running. Her dress had been fine once, town-made, the kind of dress a woman wears to church or to a wedding, and now it hung off one shoulder in a long tier that had nothing to do with brush or barbed wire. Under the tear, half hidden by a torn plaid shawl, she had wound and rewound around herself like a bandage that no longer served its purpose, was a mark, raised, pink at the edges, black at the center, shaped with a deliberateness no accident ever manages. A brand. Her name was Adaline Frost, though Elias would not learn it for another hour, and what she did not know, kneeling in the wreck of herself at the bottom of an abandoned stage road in the spring of 1883, was that the ragged, sun-cured drifter reaching past her for his canteen instead of his gun was not merely a kind stranger who happened along at the right hour. He was a hunted man. Not hunted by the law, though the law believed it had him wanted, but hunted by the very mining company whose mark was burned into her shoulder, and by men who would have paid a great deal of money to know he was sitting still in one place long enough for them to find him. Two strangers, each carrying a secret heavy enough to kill them both, meeting at the bottom of a dry well in the last dark before sunrise. If you're just joining us tonight, hit that subscribe button before we go on and drop a word in the comments telling us where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Some of you are just now getting off a long shift. Some of you haven't slept yet. Either way, pour something warm, get comfortable, and let's go back 3 days to the morning. This all began in the Arizona Territory, in the shadow of a company town known as Seth's Notch, where a young woman's brother owed a debt he never should have signed his name to. Adaline Frost had grown up believing that hard work paid a family's debts, because for most of her life it had. Her father ran freight out of the Notch before the railroad spur made freighting a dying trade, and when he died of a lung fever 2 winters back, it was her older brother Caleb who took over what was left of the business, a wagon, 4 mules, and a reputation for honesty. Caleb was not a bad man. He was a frightened one, which the desert has a way of turning into the same thing if you give it enough time. The freight work dried up faster than either of them expected. Once the Ironwood Consolidated Mining Company finished laying its spur line down from the northern camps, and a scared man with idle hands and a debt already owed on the wagon, where the cards were dealt by men who never lost, and the whiskey was poured a little heavier for customers who couldn't afford to think straight. Caleb signed a marker that night for $400 he did not have and never would have, against collateral he did not fully understand he was offering, because the man across the table assured him it was standard territorial paper, the kind everybody signed. He was dead within the month. A fever by the company doctor's account, though there were people in the Notch who would tell you, quiet, over their own shoulder, that fevers didn't usually arrive so conveniently for men who'd started asking why a company store's card table always seemed to land its bets the same direction. Grief alone might have been survivable. What came after was not. Within a week of the burial, a company man named Otis Vane arrived at the Frost homestead with a folder of papers bearing seals that looked official because the territory had never bothered to write a law clear enough to say they weren't, and he informed Adaline in the gentle, apologetic voice of a man who has done this exact thing to a dozen other families and long ago stopped losing sleep over it, that her brother's marker had transferred upon his death to the estate, and that since the estate consisted of a used wagon, 4 aging mules, and a young unmarried woman with no other assets to her name, the company was within its rights under contract labor statute to bind her service against the balance, $400. 2 years of labor in the company laundry and kitchens, Vane's papers promised her, and the debt would be considered discharged, and she'd walk away a free woman with the company's thanks. It did not work out that way. The women who went into the ironwood laundry rarely came out in 2 years, because the company found ways to add to the balance. A broken dish here, a torn sheet there, board and lodging billed against wages that were never quite paid, until 2 years became 4, became indefinite. She endured 6 months of it before the overseer, who ran the bond department, took a personal interest in her, the way certain men in certain positions of unchecked power always seem to find a reason to take a personal interest in a young woman with no family left to object. When she refused him, plainly, more than once, the company found a use for her refusal. The company termed it discipline, or making an example, so the other bondwomen would understand exactly how far their obligations extended and exactly how little say they had in the matter. And so, on a gray afternoon in a tack shed behind the company laundry, with 2 men holding her down, and a third heating an iron marked with the company's interlocked I and C in the stove, Adaline Frost was branded on the shoulder like a steer, so that if she ever did run, any company man in the territory could look at that mark and know exactly what she was and exactly who she belonged to. She ran 3 nights later during a supply wagon's cover, slipping out beneath a canvas tarp bound for the old stage road that the railroad had made obsolete, and the company had therefore stopped bothering to patrol. She walked when the wagon turned off toward the mine, walked through 1 whole night and the better part of 2 days on stolen bread and a canteen she'd lifted from a hook by the kitchen door, following the ghost of a road that hadn't carried a stagecoach in 6 years because it was the one route out of that country the company men wouldn't think to watch. By the second dawn, her feet had stopped registering pain as pain, just as a kind of distant weather happening to somebody else, and when she came at last to the old relay station at Antelope Well, where a stage line used to change horses twice a week before the world moved on without it, she found the well dry, the barn roof fallen, and her own strength gone entirely, all at the same moment, so that she went down at the cistern stone lip the way a lamp goes out, without ceremony, without even the decency of a final flare. The men who did this to her had names, and, If you're going to understand what happened next, you ought to know them the way the whole territory eventually came to know them, which is to say, too well and far too late. Harlan Seff ran the Ironwood Consolidated's territorial operations out of the Notch, and he had built, in 11 years, an empire out of other men's bad luck. He did not think of himself as a villain. Men rarely do. He thought of himself as a builder of civilization in a wilderness that had no civilization to speak of before he arrived with capital and contracts and the patience to enforce both. And if that civilization required a certain number of families to be quietly ground down into labor, and Harlan Seff had never once in his life paid a price he could instead pass along to somebody weaker than himself. His particular vice was not cruelty exactly, though he was plenty capable of it. He had convinced himself so thoroughly and for so long that the law and the territory and God himself were all on the side of a man who owned the only mine, the only store, and the only paper that could turn a debt into a life sentence. That he had genuinely stopped being able to imagine a version of events where anyone successfully denied him. Beneath him, running the bond department and administering its discipline, was a foreman named Boyd Tilson, a big, soft-spoken man whose gentleness of manner made the things he did with his hands all the worse to witness, because he never once raised his voice while he did them. Tilson had held the branding iron himself in that tack shed, and he had gone home afterward and eaten a decent supper and slept a full 8 hours, and that, more than any single cruelty, is what revealed the kind of man he was. His vice was a taste for it. Somewhere in the years of enforcing company discipline against people who had no recourse, Boyd Tilson had discovered that he liked his work, and once a man discovers that about himself, there is very little left of him worth appealing to. Seff's other instrument was a hired gun named Ruel Kessler, brought up from the mining camps of Sonora 2 years back, for the specific purpose of tracking down runaway bond laborers before they crossed into country where the company's paper. Kessler dressed well, kept his voice soft, and carried himself like a man who had never lost a fight, which was not quite true, but he had made certain that the men who beat him were all of them dead now and unavailable to correct the record. His vice was cowardice, dressed up as caution, a bone-deep unwillingness to face any threat he had not first stacked the odds against 3 or 4 to 1, which made him exactly the kind of man who would recognize, faster than anyone else in Seff's employ. And then there was Otis Vane, the company clerk, the man in the good coat with the folder of papers and the seals that looked official, who never fired a shot and never held an iron, and would have been horrified, genuinely horrified, to be labeled a villain, because Otis Vane's particular gift was making cruelty look like paperwork. He was the one who found the statute. He was the one who wrote the marker language tight enough that no territorial judge would question it. Every brand Boyd Tilson ever burned into a person's shoulder, Otis Vane had first made legal on a page, and a case could be made, though nobody in the Notch ever quite dared to make it out loud, that a clerk with a fountain pen had done more lasting harm in that country than either of the other 2 men combined. That was the company Adaline Frost had run from, and that was the company that would soon enough come looking for her, because a bondwoman who escaped with the company's brand still fresh on her shoulder was not merely an inconvenience to men like Seff. She was a liability. If word ever reached a territorial marshal with the stomach to investigate, if that brand was ever shown to the wrong pair of eyes, the whole bond labor operation could unravel, and Harlan Seff had not spent 11 years building an empire to watch it come apart over one laundry girl's stubbornness. So even as Adaline collapsed at the dry cistern at Antelope Well, 3 riders were already saddling up back at the notch, under orders to bring her back quiet, or not bring her back at all. Now, let's go back to that cistern and to the ragged, sun-cured drifter who found her there, because his part in this story had been a long time coming, longer than anyone at Antelope Well that morning could have guessed. Elias Crane was 44 years old, though the sun and the years had put closer to 60 into the lines of his face, and he had ridden into that stretch of the territory the way he rode into every stretch of territory these last 3 years, alone, unhurried, and careful never to sleep in a place he'd slept before. He kept a pack horse rather than a spare mount, because a pack horse raised no questions about where a man was headed or why he changed his route so often. And he carried a rifle that had clearly been cared for by somebody who understood exactly how much his life might one day depend on it. He did not give his name in towns unless he had to, and when he had to, it was rarely the name his mother gave him. He had learned the hard way that a man with a bounty on his head does not get to have the comforts other men take for granted. A regular bed, a regular face at a regular saloon, a woman who knows him well enough to worry when he's late. He had traded all of that 3 years back for the simple privilege of staying alive and staying free. And some mornings, riding alone through country as empty as the inside of a held breath, he wondered honestly whether the trade had been worth making. He came upon the old stage road out of habit more than plan, because abandoned roads made for safer travel than the ones the railroad had made popular. Fewer eyes, fewer questions, fewer men riding the kind of horses that meant business. He smelled the cistern before he saw it, a smell his years on the drift had taught him to take seriously, because a smell like that at that hour usually meant something had died recently. He came off his horse 40 yards out and closed the rest of the distance on foot, quiet, rifle low but ready. The way a man moves when he has learned the cost of assuming a situation is safer than it looks. What he found, when he came around the fallen edge of the old barn, was a young woman curled at the stone lip of a dry well, breathing shallow and fast, one hand fisted white-knuckled in the folds of a torn shawl held against her own shoulder. Was a danger she could not afford to risk. He stopped there a moment, taking the whole scene in the way a careful man takes in any scene before he commits himself to it, and then he set the rifle down against the cistern wall, well within reach, but plainly, deliberately, out of his own hands, and he came the rest of the way, slow, on his knees, the posture of a man announcing to anyone watching that he had come in peace and intended to keep it that way. "Ma'am," his voice came out rough from disuse, a voice that hadn't talked to another living soul in the better part of a week. She startled awake at the sound of it, flinched back against the stone hard enough to hurt herself worse, both arms coming up instinctively to shield her shoulder, her face, her whole battered self, from a blow she plainly expected. "I'm not going to touch you." He stayed exactly where he was, hands open, palms out, the coat he'd already shrugged, half off his own shoulders, held out at arm's length instead of laid over her, because he understood, the way a hunted man understands these things faster than most, that the worst thing he could do to a person that's scared was close the distance himself. "You're safe from me. That's the whole of it. Take the coat if you want it or don't, but nobody's laying a hand on you while I'm sitting here." It took her the better part of a minute to believe him, or at least to believe him enough to stop bracing, and when she finally did reach for the coat, her hand shook so badly it took her 2 tries to close her fingers around the collar. She pulled it around herself, and in doing so, the torn shawl slipped, just enough, just for a moment, to show him what she had been so carefully hiding. He did not react the way she plainly expected him to. He did not recoil, did not gasp, did not reach for the obvious question most men would have reached for first. He went very still instead, the particular stillness of a man who has seen something ugly enough times before that his body has learned to absorb the shock quietly, so as not to frighten the person standing in front of him even worse than they already are. Somebody did that to you. It came out flat, not a question at all, because there was no honest way to shape it as one. She pulled the shawl back up over it, fast, defensive, an old habit rebuilding itself in half a second. It's nothing you need worry over. I didn't ask whether I needed to worry. I asked whether somebody did it to you. He kept his voice low, even the tone a man uses on a spooked horse, not because he thought her simple, but because he understood, better than almost anyone alive, what it cost a person to hold themselves together after something like that. You don't owe me the story, but you're sitting at a dry well 20 miles from the nearest water that isn't hauled in by wagon, with a company mark burned into your shoulder, and 3 riders' worth of dust starting to show on the road behind you, if I'm reading that horizon right. So we can sit here and be polite about it, or you can tell me what I'm about to be standing between you and that. Got her attention in a way the coat and the gentle voice hadn't quite managed. She followed his eyes to the horizon, to the faint smudge of dust rising where the old road met the new one, and something in her face changed, the exhaustion burning off for just a moment under a flare of pure animal fear. Her voice had gone thin and fast. That's Seth's men. They'll have tracked the wagon. They'll know I slipped it somewhere along this stretch. Her voice caught, and she pressed the back of one filthy hand against her mouth like she could hold the panic in by force. You should go. Right now, before they see your horse. I won't hold it against you. Nobody in their right mind would stay. Elias Crane looked at the dust on the horizon a long moment, the way a man looks at a hand of cards he already knows he's going to play, and then he picked his rifle back up off the cistern wall, checked the load out of pure habit, and settled himself onto the stone rim beside her. My name's Elias. He held her gaze steady. And, where I come from, a man doesn't leave a woman to be dragged off by 3 riders just because staying might be inconvenient for him. He didn't tell her, not yet, exactly how inconvenient staying was likely to be. He didn't tell her that his own name, spoken loud enough in the wrong company, carried a bounty large enough to retire on. He didn't tell her that the 3 riders coming up that dusty road belonged, as it happened, to the very same company whose men had once put a price on his own head, years back, over a debt that had nothing to do with money, and everything to do with a dead man neither of them had met yet, and whose ghost had been riding beside Elias Crane every mile of every road he'd traveled since. All of that would come out, but not yet. For now, there was only a woman with a fresh brand and old bruises, 3 riders closing the distance, and a drifter who had decided, in the space of about 90 seconds, that whatever peace he'd been chasing these last 3 years was going to have to wait one more day. Before we get into what happened when those 3 riders reached the well, I want to ask something of you, if this story's got its hooks in you the way it should by now. Consider becoming a channel member. It's a small way to support what we do here, and all it takes is tapping the join button right beside the channel name. Now, back to the well, and to the three men riding hard toward a drifter who had every reason in the world to already be gone. The riders were Rourke Kessler and two company hands, sent out ahead of the main party, while Boyd Tilson and Harlan Seff himself organized a larger response back at the Notch. They came up the old stage road at a hard trot, dust rolling behind them, and Kessler's eyes went first to the woman huddled at the cistern, and then, sharper, more careful, to the man sitting beside her with the rifle laid casual across his knees like it had grown there. Elias let the riders close to within 30 yards before he used his voice at all, easy and unbothered across the flat ground, the voice of a man greeting a neighbor over a fence line rather than a man watching three strangers approach with a purpose he already understood perfectly well. "Morning. You're a fair piece off the company road." Kessler reined up at what he clearly believed was a respectful distance, and gave the drifter a long look, the kind of look a man gives when he's deciding how much trouble the fellow in front of him is likely to be. "That woman there belongs to the Ironwood Consolidated Bond Labor. Escaped 3 nights back. We've come to bring her home. She looks to me like a person, not property." Elias hadn't moved an inch. And, last I checked, this territory hadn't gotten around to writing a law that changes one into the other, no matter what kind of paper a company clerk drew up. He hadn't raised his voice at all, hadn't moved from where he sat, and that stillness, more than any threat he could have made, was what put the first real doubt into Rourke Kessler's face. Men who intend violence usually announce it with their bodies before their mouths get around to the words. This man's body wasn't announcing anything at all, and that kind of quiet Kessler had learned the hard way over a long career of exactly this kind of work, was the quiet that belonged to men who had already decided how the next few minutes were going to go. "You're making a mistake, mister, whoever you are." One of the two hands beside Kessler began slow to ease his hand toward the rifle across his own saddle. "Don't." The word came out quiet, and still it landed in that dry morning air like a dropped anvil. "You draw that rifle, and this conversation stops being one where anybody rides away whole. I've got no interest in killing a man today over another man's greed, but I'll do it if you make me, and you strike me as smart enough to already know that." He let that settle a moment, watched the hand freeze halfway to the stock, and then, almost gently, went on. "Ride back and tell whoever sent you that the woman's not going anywhere with anybody today. If your Mr. Seff wants to discuss it further, he's welcome to come discuss it himself. In daylight, in front of whatever passes for a lawman in this territory. I expect he won't much care for that arrangement." It was, in its way, exactly the kind of line the old-timers around a campfire would repeat for years after, not because it was loud, but because of the man behind it and how little it cost him to make good on it. Kessler sat his horse a long moment. Doing arithmetic Elias could watch happening behind the man's eyes, 3 against 1. But the one wasn't flinching, and the one had a rifle that had clearly seen use. And Kessler's own particular vice, the caution that had kept him alive through a dozen uglier standoffs than this one, was already telling him that today was not the day to find out how good this stranger really was. He backed his horse 2 full steps before he turned it. "Skeff, we'll hear about this." It was less a threat than an admission that he was leaving. "I expect he will." Elias held Kessler's eyes until the man looked away first. "Tell him my name's Crane, so he knows exactly who to blame when this goes worse for him than he's planning on." He hadn't meant to say it. It came out of some old buried instinct, The drifter's pride he thought he'd buried 3 years back along with everything else, and the moment the word left his mouth he understood, with the particular cold clarity of a man watching a stone leave his hand toward a window he can't call back, that he had just handed Rourke Kessler the one piece of information capable of turning a routine recapture into something much larger and much worse. Adaline felt him go rigid beside her the instant the riders were out of earshot, and when she looked over at him, the calm, unbothered stranger from a minute before had gone somewhere else, entirely replaced by a man staring at his own hands like they'd betrayed him. Crane. She tested the name like it might bite. That's not nothing. The way that man's face changed when you said it. Who are you? He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost the easy calm it carried during the standoff, gone, instead low and tired, the voice of a man setting down a weight he'd been carrying so long he'd nearly forgotten its shape. 3 years back, I rode with a man named Silas Rourke. Survey work, mostly, chain and compass work, for the outfit that first staked the Ironwood claim before Seth's company bought them out and Rourke went to work for the new owners instead. Rourke was a friend of mine once. And then he wasn't, and then he was dead, and every company man from here to the Nevada line believes I'm the one who killed him. He looked at her then, and there was nothing hidden in his face at all, none of the careful blankness he'd worn since she'd first seen him. It's the truth. As it happens, I did kill him, but not the way the company's paper says I did. And there's a difference wide enough to drive a wagon through, if anybody in this territory ever cared to look. The tale of Rourke Kessler's retreat reached Harlan Seth by midday, and it reached him with a name attached that changed everything about how the overseer intended to handle the situation. Skeff had heard the name Elias Crane before, whispered among the mine's older hands, the way a name gets whispered when it belongs to a story men aren't quite sure is true. A gunslinger, some said, though the word had gone soft and half-legendary with retelling. A man who'd put down 3 of Rourke's own hired guns in a fight nobody official ever investigated. Who'd been running from a murder charge ever since a charge. Seth himself, if he were honest with the version of himself he kept locked away from daylight. Knew to be considerably more complicated than the paperwork suggested. He sat with that knowledge for the length of one long cigar, and by the time he'd finished it, ambition had done what ambition always did to Harlan Seth, which was overwrite whatever small, uncomfortable doubt might otherwise have slowed him down. A bounty existed on Elias Crane, a real one, filed years back by the original mining outfit and never rescinded, large enough that half the gun hands in the territory would ride 200 miles for a shot at it. If Crane truly was sitting still at a dry relay station 20 miles out, guarding a runaway bondwoman who could, if she ever got free and got believed, unravel the entire bond labor operation Seth had spent a decade building. The smart play was to end both problems in the same afternoon, with enough armed men that neither the drifter's reputation nor the woman's desperation would matter in the slightest. He sent for every hired gun currently drawing wages at the Ironwood Works, 9 men beyond Kessler and Tilson themselves, a number Seth considered generously excessive for one drifter and one exhausted woman, which tells you something true and unflattering about how Harlan Seth had come to think about the value of overwhelming force. He even, in a decision he would come to regret with an intensity that surprised him, ordered Otis Vane along for the ride, on the theory that a company clerk's presence lent an air of lawful legitimacy, to whatever happened at that relay station, and that, having his paperwork on hand to formalize the recapture, or the killing, whichever proved necessary, would save time later. Vane protested mildly, the way Vane protested everything, and was overruled, the way Vane was always overruled, and climbed into the supply wagon with his folder of seals and his fountain pen and a knot of unease in his stomach that he could not, at that point, have named even to himself. They rode out from the notch in the late afternoon, 12 men and a wagon, dust rising behind them thick enough to be seen from 10 miles off by anyone with the sense to watch the horizon, which was exactly what Elias Crane had spent the intervening hours doing. He had used the time well. A man doesn't survive 3 years on the drift, most of it with a price on his head, without learning how to turn a piece of empty, indefensible ground into something considerably less inviting to walk into. The dry well itself sat at the center of a shallow bowl in the land, ringed by the collapsed barn, a half-standing tack shed, and the low stone foundation of what had once been the relay keeper's house. And Elias spent the better part of the afternoon walking that ground the way a man walks a chessboard before the first move, marking the places a rider would have to slow to pick his way through fallen timber, marking the one clear approach a wagon could actually manage and the several it could not. He strung what wire he had salvaged from the collapsed barn's old fence line low across, the 2 most obvious approach paths tied through a scatter of tin cups and horseshoes he found rusting in the tack shed, the kind of makeshift alarm a cavalry scout learns to rig from nothing because the desert rarely offers anything better. He showed Adaline how to load and fire the spare pistol he carried in his saddlebag, a battered old Colt that had seen better decades, walking her through it patient and unhurried despite the hours bleeding away, because a scared hand on a gun for the first time, and he had no intention of losing her to her own inexperience before the company's men ever arrived. "You don't have to be a gunfighter," he told her, steadying her wrists as she sighted down the barrel at a fence post 40 feet off, her hands shaking so badly the front sight wandered in slow circles. "You just have to be steady enough at the one moment it matters to remind a man that you're not the helpless thing he's decided you are. That's all a gun ever really does for anybody. It's not about killing. It's about a person's right to decide they won't be taken." She lowered the pistol after her third shot went wide of the post, by a full arm's length, frustration and exhaustion catching up with her all at once, and sat heavily on an overturned crate, the shawl slipping again. "I keep thinking about the day they did this to me," she said, quiet, not quite looking at him. "I used to believe if I just worked hard enough, if I was patient enough, it would eventually be fair. My father raised me to believe that. Work honest, and the world evens out eventually." She touched the edge of the brand through the torn fabric, an old habit already, checking it was still there, still real, the way a person touches a wound, to be sure the pain isn't imagined. "It doesn't even out on its own. Men like Seth make sure of that." "No," Elias agreed. "It doesn't even out on its own. Sometimes it takes somebody standing in the way of it long enough that it has no choice but to even out." He crouched in front of her, met her eyes directly, the way he hadn't quite let himself do until that moment. "I told you my name because Kessler was going to carry it back, regardless, and I'd rather you heard the truth of who I am from me than from whatever story Seth's men build around it. I've spent 3 years running because I was too proud, or too tired, or too plain scared to stand still long enough to make anybody believe the truth about Silas Rourke. I'm done running, not because I've suddenly gotten brave, because I looked at you sitting at that well this morning and understood that if I rode off and let those men take you back to that laundry, I'd have spent 3 years protecting nothing worth protecting. A man's life isn't worth much if the only thing he's kept safe with it is himself." She studied him a long moment in the fading light, something in her face settling the fear still present but no longer alone, joined now by something steadier. "Tell me about Rourke," she said. "All of it. If we're going to stand here together tonight, I want to know exactly what kind of storm I'm standing in." So he told her, while the light went gold and then gray and then gone, while the wire trap sat waiting in the dark and the horses shifted uneasy in the ruined barn, sensing the way horses do. He told her that Silas Rourke had been once a genuinely good man, or good enough, a surveyor by trade who'd taken Elias on as a chainman on the original Ironwood claim survey 4 years back, before Seth's company ever entered the picture, when the claim still belonged to a modest outfit of prospectors who'd struck a decent vein and needed the boundary properly staked before anyone bigger came sniffing around it. Elias and Rourke had ridden that survey together for the better part of a year, eaten 100 meals at the same fire, and Elias had genuinely believed, in the particular way a younger man believes these things before life corrects him, that he'd found a friend. Then the Ironwood Consolidated bought out the original claim, and Seth arrived with capital and contracts, and the boundary Rourke had staked so carefully turned out by an inconvenient accident of geography to run directly through a homestead belonging to a family named Marsh, 4 people, a husband and wife, and 2 children, who had settled that particular quarter section 2 full years before any survey ever touched it, and who had, by every honest reading of territorial land law, the better claim. Seth wanted the marshland anyway, because there was ore under it, and Seth had never in his life allowed an honest reading of the law to stand between himself and ore. He offered Rourke a new position, foreman of company security, generous wages, and a simple task: convince the Marsh family to sell. When convincing failed, because the Marshes were stubborn people who had buried a child on that land, and had no intention of leaving the grave behind, convincing became something else. "I found out what Rourke was planning 2 days before he did it," Elias said, his voice gone flat and careful the way a man's voice goes when he is retelling something he has spent 3 years trying not to remember in this much detail. He'd been ordered to burn the Marsh place out. Not kill anybody outright, Seth was careful about that much even then, but burn the barn, the well cover, enough of the property that the family would have no choice but to take the company's buyout and leave before winter caught them with nothing. I confronted him about it, begged him not to do it, told him I'd known him a year, and never once seen him be the kind of man who'd burn a family's water source in high summer country and call it business. He stopped, jaw working, and Adaline, without quite deciding to, reached over and put her hand over his where it rested on his knee. "He did it anyway," Elias went on. "I got there partway through, tried to stop him, and there was a fight, out behind the marsh well, in the dark, with the barn already catching. I didn't go there to kill him, I went there to stop him. But he had a knife, and I had my hands, and by the time it was over, he was dead, and the barn was ash, and I was standing in front of a family who just watched 2 company men fight to the death over their own property." His hand, turned under hers, gripped it. Skeff's company reported it as murder. Said I'd ambushed Rourke over a personal grudge, filed the bounty within a week, and the Marsh family, God help them, were too afraid of what the company might do next to ever tell the true story to anyone who could have cleared me. I don't blame them for that. I blame Seth and Vane's paperwork, and every hand in that company who found it easier to let a lie stand than to risk their own position by telling the truth. Did you save the well cover? Adaline asked. The family. Did they keep the land? Elias was quiet a long moment. For a while, he said, Seth found another way, inside 2 years later. I don't know what became of them after that. I never went back to ask. I told myself it was because going back would get me caught, and that was true enough. But the honest truth is I couldn't face them. I stopped Rourke that one night, and it still wasn't enough. And I've spent 3 years running from a bounty that isn't even the worst thing I did wrong. The worst thing I did wrong was leave before I finished the job. You're finishing it now, Adaline said, quiet but certain, and something in the way she said it, plain and unadorned, without pity, landed on him harder than any speech could have. They did not sleep that night, not really, though they took turns pretending to, and somewhere past midnight, the first faint jingle of a disturbed wire, off to the northeast, where the barn's fallen timber forced any rider to slow, Harlan Seth had brought 12 men and a wagon to take one drifter and one exhausted woman, a number that spoke less to any real assessment of the threat than to Seth's own certainty that overwhelming force solved every problem it was pointed at. And it was that same certainty, more than anything, Elias Crane did that night. That ended up costing him the fight before it had properly begun. A company man who has never once faced real resistance does not know how to recognize a trap laid by somebody who has spent 3 years surviving exactly this kind of situation, and Elias had spent the whole afternoon making certain that every advantage of numbers Seth believed he held would turn piece by piece into a liability instead. The wire at the northeast approach did exactly what wire strung with tin cups and horseshoes is meant to do, which is announce, loud and unmistakable in the desert quiet, that somebody uninvited has arrived. And it did so while the lead riders were still picking their way through fallen barn timber in a column too narrow to let more than 2 men through abreast. Elias fired one shot into the dark above their heads. No aim at a man at all. Just noise and muzzle flash meant to freeze a column of riders who did not yet know how many guns they were facing. That's a warning, he called out into the sudden chaos of spooked horses and shouting men. Next one won't be. Skeff, if you're back there hiding behind hired men the way I expect you are, you might want to come forward and explain to your own hands exactly how many of them you're willing to spend tonight over one woman's bond papers. It bought confusion, which was worth more in that moment than any number of hits, because confused men in the dark shoot at shadows and trip over their own feet, and more than anything else, start asking themselves questions their employer had never bothered to answer for them. Questions like exactly how much they were being paid to risk their lives against a man who plainly knew this ground far better than they did. 2 of the hired guns, men drawing ordinary wages for what they'd believed was an ordinary recaptured job, peeled off within the first 5 minutes and did not come back, deciding, with the particular clarity a gunshot in the dark tends to provide, that Harlan Seth's payroll did not stretch far enough to cover this. Boyd Tilson pushed forward anyway, because Tilson's particular vice, the taste he'd developed for inflicting pain on people who couldn't fight back, made him exactly the wrong kind of man to recognize when a fight had turned into something he couldn't win through cruelty alone. He came around the collapsed barn's western edge, rifle up, moving toward the tack shed where he plainly expected to find Adaline hiding, and it was Adaline herself, not Elias, who stepped out from behind the shed's broken doorframe with the old Colt held in both shaking hands, and put a bullet into him before he'd finished turning toward the sound of her boot on gravel. It was not a killing shot, delivered in cold calculation. It was a woman who had been branded like livestock and dragged through 6 months of a nightmare of somebody else's making, finally, given one clean chance to stop the man who'd held the iron himself. And she took it without a moment's hesitation. And Boyd Tilson went down in the dirt of the same relay station where he'd come to drag her back into bondage, and did not get back up. The sound of that shot changed the whole shape of the fight. Rourke, positioned well back from the fighting the way his own particular cowardice always positioned him, heard his foreman go down and made the calculation he'd been quietly running since Elias Crane first said his own name back at the well that morning, and he turned his horse and rode hard back the way he'd come, abandoning the fight entirely rather than risk becoming the next body in the dirt. That left Harlan Seff himself, who had ridden along at the very rear of the column, well protected, fully intending to arrive only after his hired men had finished the dangerous work, and who now found himself, in the space of about 4 minutes, stripped of his foreman, and facing a relay station defended by exactly the 2 people he had come to eliminate, both of them. As it turned out, considerably harder to eliminate than he had allowed himself to imagine. It would have been the sensible choice, the choice a less certain man would have made the moment his own hired guns started peeling off into the darkness. But Harlan Seff had built 11 years of empire on the conviction that he did not lose, that men like him simply did not find themselves outmaneuvered by drifters and laundrywomen, and that conviction, in the end, carried him forward into the light of Elias Crane's rifle. "Crane," he called out, and there was still, even now, an oiled confidence in his voice, the voice of a man who believed the conversation could still be steered somewhere in his favor if he simply kept talking. "You've made a genuine mess of my evening, but I'm a reasonable man. Hand the girl back over, and I'll see to it the bounty on your head quietly disappears. I have that kind of reach in this territory. You clearly know it, or you wouldn't have spent 3 years running from it. You don't have the reach to make 3 years of running worth trading for 1 more day of watching you own people," Elias said, stepping into view himself now, rifle steady, the calm of the man at the well that morning entirely restored. "And you're not half as reasonable as you think you are, or you'd have noticed by now that your foreman's dead, your gunman's run, and the only 2 men left standing at this well are the 2 you rode out here to erase. That should tell you something about how the rest of tonight is likely to go." It was Otis Vane of all people who tipped the final balance, arriving on foot from where the supply wagon had stopped well short of the fighting, his folder of papers clutched against his chest like a shield that had never once actually protected anyone. He had spent the whole engagement crouched behind the wagon, sick with a fear he did not entirely understand until this exact moment, listening to gunfire and the screams of dying men over a woman's bond debt, and something in him finally broke loose. "Mr. Seff," he called out, his voice thin and shaking in the dark, "I can't do this anymore. I have the original marker, the real one, in my folder. The one that shows Caleb Frost's debt was never $400. It was 40. I inflated the figure myself, on your instruction, the same way I inflated a dozen others, because you told me the extra money justified the paperwork required to bind a person's whole life to it. I've got Rourke's real incident report, too. the one I was told to destroy and kept instead because some part of me always knew we'd need it someday to prove we hadn't done what we did. He stepped forward into the faint light, and, though his hand shook badly enough to rattle the papers, his voice, when he spoke again, had found something it had never once had before. Not about the debt, and not about what happens here. Harlan Seff turned on his own clerk with a look of pure, uncomprehending fury, the look of a man watching the one piece of his machine he'd never bothered to worry about suddenly refuse to turn, and in that half-second of distraction, with his attention split between the drifter in front of him, Adaline Frost stepped forward out of the shadow of the tack shed, the old Colt steady now in hands that had stopped shaking somewhere in the last 10 minutes, and leveled it directly at the man who had ordered the iron heated in that tack shed 6 months back. "You branded me like I was livestock," she said, and her voice did not shake at all. "You told Vane to write my brother's debt 10 times higher than it was so you could own me for it. You sent 12 men to a dry well in the middle of the night to make sure nobody ever heard the truth about any of it. I'm done being quiet so men like you can keep calling it business." Seff's hand moved toward the pistol at his own hip, a final, desperate reflex from a man who had never once in 11 years faced a consequence he couldn't buy or bury, and Adaline fired before his hand had cleared leather, one clean shot, and Harlan Seff, at the very last, faced entirely alone. The silence that followed was the kind the old-timers talk about when they tell you the desert itself seemed to hold its breath. Even the horses went still. Otis Vane stood frozen with his folder of papers clutched against his chest, and Elias Crane lowered his rifle slow, and Adaline Frost stood over the man who had owned her, shaking now, finally, all the strength that had carried her through the fight draining out of her at once, so that it was Elias who caught her before her knees gave entirely, the same way he'd caught her that first morning at the Cistern. Only this time there was nothing left to run from. It took 3 weeks for the truth of that night to work its way properly through the territory, but work its way it did, because Otis Vane, once he'd made his choice at Antelope Well, did not go back on it. He carried his folder of real papers to the territorial marshal's office in the next county over, gave a full accounting of the inflated bond debts and the falsified incident report on Silas Rourke's death, and named, in careful, clerkly detail, exactly how the Ironwood Consolidated's local operation had turned company law into a machine for stealing years, and sometimes whole lives from people with no power to object. The bounty on Elias Crane was formally withdrawn within the month, the marshal's office finding, on the strength of Vane's report, and the Marsh family's long-buried testimony finally sought out and taken seriously, that Rourke's death had been, if anything, closer to a rescue gone wrong than a murder. The bond labor operation at the Notch was dissolved entirely inside the season, its remaining laborers, a dozen women, and half again as many men, released from debts that had never been legitimate to begin with, and the company itself stripped of the overseer who had built its worst practices, retreated from that stretch of territory within the year, chasing easier ground somewhere the law hadn't yet caught up to them. Adaline Frost used what little the settlement afforded her, along with the old Antelope Well relay station itself, granted to her outright by a territorial court that had for once found itself moved to something like justice. Not for stagecoaches this time, but for exactly the kind of desperate running, half-broken people she herself had once been. Women fleeing bonds and debts, and men who believed ownership was simply a matter of the right paperwork. She called it Frost's Rest, and word of it traveled the territory the way word of a safe harbor always travels among people who badly need one. Quiet, careful, mouth to mouth, until there was hardly a bond laborer or runaway wife within 200 miles who hadn't heard, in a low voice, over a fire, that there was a well at Antelope Well that never ran dry for the people who needed it most. Elias Crane stayed through that first hard season, helped her raise a new barn where the old one had fallen, taught 2 of the arriving women to shoot the way he'd taught her, and there was in those months something between them that the old-timers who eventually heard this story liked to call love, though Elias himself would only ever call it the plainest, hardest won kind. The kind 2 people build when they've each spent years learning exactly how rare it is. He did not stay forever. A man who has spent 3 years being hunted does not entirely trust stillness even after the reason for running has been cleared away, and one gray morning near the first frost of the following year, he saddled his horse and told her plain and without apology, out where people knew his name and didn't reach for a gun over it. "You could stay," she told him, standing at the well that had saved them both, the same stone rim, the same dry desert light, though nothing else about the 2 of them standing there was the same as it had been that first cold morning. "I could," he agreed, "and maybe someday I will, for good, but I've spent 3 years running from something. I think I owe it to both of us to spend a season or 2 just riding toward something instead, and see what that feels like before I ask you to build a life around a man who's never once tried it." He touched her cheek, brief, gentle, the way a man touches something he intends to come back for. "You'll always know exactly where I am if you need me. That much I promise you plainly. Frost's Rest isn't ever going to be a place I forget the road back to." He rode out that morning the way he'd ridden into her life, alone, unhurried, a single figure shrinking into the wide gold light of a territory that had for once given somebody exactly the justice they'd earned, and Adaline Frost watched him go from the well he'd found her collapsed beside. Women who had walked further than she ever had were waiting to be shown the well that never ran dry. Folks, that's the story of Adaline Frost and the drifter who found her, and I expect a few of you are sitting there wondering, same as I always do telling these old tales, how a man carries a debt like Elias Crane carried his and comes out the other side of it still capable of kindness at all. I'll tell you what I've come to believe, sitting by fires like this one, for more years than I care to count. A man's past can explain the shape of him. It does not have to define the whole of what he becomes. The real darkness in this territory was never the drifters and the runaways, the ones the company men like to call trouble. It was the quiet rooms where good men like Otis Vane before that last night at the well, decided it was easier to say nothing than to risk what they had. Remember that wherever you're listening from tonight. And if this story kept you good company, consider becoming a channel member. Just tap that join button beside the channel name. It helps keep tales like this one coming. Give this video a like. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what the night looks like out your window. And subscribe if you haven't yet, so you don't miss the next one. Until our trails cross again, partner, keep your powder dry and your soul a little more honest than the world tries to make you.